A very brief history of anthropology. So for this class, we're going to be looking at the roots of anthropology as well as prominent anthropologists, and then kind of giving a brief sort of survey of how anthropology has changed through the years. So when first sort of looking at the roots of anthropology, we have to really talk about the history of exploration and colonization. As European and then later American explorers, colonial settlers, and missionaries began to explore the world, they would write down accounts of the indigenous populations. For European and American settlers and missionaries, indigenous populations in the Americas, South Asia, Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, were seen as being stuck in a primitive time, meaning that they were seen as kind of like a time capsule, being that here's this community that has never been civilized. They don't know what it's like to live in a civilized world, and therefore isn't this community sort of this precious, special sort of glimpse into the past. And the idea that, that Native Americans were stuck in a primitive time really sort of coincided with the idea of social evolution, or what we also can call social Darwinism to a certain extent. And it's birthed in the 19th century Victorian age of social evolution, in which there was this belief that all human societies developed in one particular direction, so from savage all the way up to civilized. Now, European societies were believed to embody the most civilized. But of course, who's creating these terms of who's more civilized than the other? Well, it's the Europeans and the white American settlers. So again, it's pretty kind of skewed of who's really more civilized than the other. But this idea did spread, and it spread through technological advances of the Industrial Revolution, and the spread of European and American colonialism also contributed to this belief. So in that Europeans and white American settlers believed that it was their duty, or the white man's burden, to civilize the savages through colonialism, so ruling, taking them off their land, forcing them to speak English, to also forcing them to convert to Christianity through missionary work. It cannot be stated enough that social evolution as an idea is completely false. There's no such thing as this idea that certain societies are more primitive than others. That sort of thinking is completely false, and unfortunately has caused an unspeakable amount of violence against both indigenous populations as well as non-European and non-white European populations around the world. But it is important to understand that during this time that these were the ideas shared by many European and American intellectuals. These ideas were also heavily influenced people's interest in recording and observing so-called primitive people. So in a way, as much damage that social evolution did, it also spurred the interest of many people to look at these communities, to record and observe them. And by recording them, American Indian thinkers thought that they could get an understanding of human nature and their primitive past. Luckily, we did move beyond social evolution. The development of anthropology in the late 20th century moved people's thinking away from social evolution to understanding culture, actor, agency, and context. So we moved away from this idea that that certain societies weren't as evolved as other societies, to actually really looking at the particularities of that community and looking at how their culture is formed by the environment that they're living in, by also their social structure, all of these factors. So in a way, we've moved away from that sort of idea that we're all on this track of evolution, but instead we're looking at the real particularities of that community. And we really owe those ideas, to the founders of cultural anthropology, which is Franz Boas, who lived from 1858 to 1942, and Bronislaw Malinowski from 1884 to 1942. Let's go into a little bit about Franz Boas. And you can see him in the corner. He's actually wearing Inuit costume. And he studied Eskimo and Kwakiutl Indians of North America in the 1890s. And Franz was really concerned about the really destructive and cultural change and loss of unique cultures, Native American cultures, due to colonization. During the time in the Pacific Northwest, the area that Franz was working in, you had these sort of rapid change of the environment and land and societies because of huge logging industry and mining industry. So forests were being clear cut, and native populations in those communities were being forced off their land. Their children were being taken away to go to residential schools where they were horribly abused, both sexually and physically, and also were forced to, basically um, not never speak their own language, never practice their own cultural beliefs, and to basically the idea was to kill the culture, kill Native American culture, so kill the Indian out of the Indian. And so Franz is seeing all of this, and his sort of mission was to collect as much as possible the songs, artworks, ceremonies, and language of these communities. And so he really focused on recording, photography, as well as creating museums to house Native American artifacts. And in fact, it has had a really strong legacy today. Many Native American communities, because of the damage of American and Canadian colonial legislation, they did lose their ability to speak their own language. But because of anthropologists like Franz and others, their language was recorded, both written and as well as maybe even recorded orally. And they were able to then, many Native American communities today have been able to relearn their language that was lost. And if you ever go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., there's a great museum right next to the Capitol, where it's the Museum of the American Indian, and a lot of actually the stuff that Franz Boas had collected is housed in that museum, so you can actually see his collection there, which is kind of cool. A big thing that Franz Boas brought to our understanding was the emphasis on cultural relativism, in which cultural values and ideas are not universally shared by everyone. So culture is relative to the society it is located in. This is very much a continuation of what we talked about last week about culture being particular. So you can't really make a universal thing that we all share a cultural belief, when in fact it's oftentimes very particular to that community for certain reasons. And Boas first articulated this idea in 1887, that civilization is not something absolute, but is relative, and our ideas and conceptions are true only so far as our civilization goes. Boas is also credited for creating the disciplines that we know that are housed in anthropology, such as cultural and social, so what we study here in this class, as well as the physical/biological anthropology, archaeology, and linguistic anthropology. Going on to Bronislaw Malinowski, he's very well known, and he's up there in the corner, as setting the standard for ethnographic field with his studies in the Trobriand Islands. Bronislaw was pretty much credited for ethnographic fieldwork, and he emphasized immersing oneself in the culture completely in order to provide an accurate, objective, and scientific first-hand account of a different way of life. He focused on the individual's actions within the framework of society's social structure, and he emphasized the idea of holism, looking at a culture as a whole and not separating it into little parts. So looking at culture as being connected. So, for example, if we talked about a particular religious practice, or even like a dietary restriction, such as not eating pork or something like that, we can't just sort of look at that one little action without looking at the other parts of the culture. So the other forces that cause that sort of particular cultural action. It's not a separate thing that exists on its own, but in fact is part of the whole sort of interconnected thing of culture. And Bronislaw really brought that to our attention. Jumping just a little bit ahead, I do want to talk about Margaret Mead, only because she's very much emphasized in this week's Reading on the Culture text. So, and Mead also is a very prominent anthropologist and has really done a lot in the field of anthropology. She was a student of Franz Boas, and again, she was a prominent figure in anthropology. And why she's prominent is that she really sort of brought forward new ideas and conceptions on the way that we talk about gender and sexuality. So for her first studies, she looked at youth culture in Samoa and saw that with the youth culture, unlike the culture that she came from, so 1920s Middle America, she saw that the young girls were a lot more sexually free in the sense that they could actually have sex and not be sort of punished by the society for having sex in marriage. And that many of these youth were not having the sort of coming of age crisis that Margaret Mead experienced as a young girl going into adulthood, or other contemporaries of hers did as well. And from this sort of study, she realizes that sexuality and the rules about sex are culturally conditioned, and they're not universally shared. So again, Mead is really important for this idea that, the way that we talk about sex and sexual acts, the morality that we might put up behind it, or even the restrictions that we put behind it, are very much culturally conditioned. They're not shared by everyone. Another sort of really important thing that Margaret Mead did was her work on gender. So she traveled to Papua New Guinea in 1931 to determine to the extent in which gender roles were the product of biology, genes, or culture. So the kind of idea of nature versus nurture. And she studied three major tribes in Papua New Guinea: the Arapesh, and the Mundugamur, and the Tchambuli. And what Mead observed in these three tribes and concluded that each tribe raised their children under very different gender roles and norms. So here you have three different tribes that Margaret Mead is looking at, and she sees that they raise their children very differently according to gender. So for the Arapesh, Mead discovers, or sort of realizes or finds, that both the males and the females were conditioned to be cooperative, unaggressive, and empathetic, so more caring, more submissive. And she concludes that, the Arapesh really raised their children to be more feminine, or at least what she considers feminine. However, the Mundugamur Mead finds them to be more aggressive. She concludes that they raise their children to be more ruthless, more aggressive, more unresponsive to the needs of others, so less empathetic, more dominant, so both the males and the females. However, with the Tchambuli, she found that they raise their children opposite to Western ideas of gender. So they're kind of like a mirror to Western ideas of gender, being that the females in this community were raised to be more dominant, impersonal, aggressive, assertive, whereas the males in this society were raised to be more dependent, submissive, emotional. So kind of, again, this idea that they're completely opposites. So what comes out of this is that Mead sees that in just these three different tribes in Papua New Guinea, they raise their children according to gender very differently. And that, she concludes that humans are flexible enough to rule out biological determination of gender roles. What does that mean? That means that gender roles are not fixed at birth. No one is born a woman, one is made a woman into their culture. And that it's actually, fairly easy to raise men who are submissive, or what Mead considered feminine, and women to be what Mead considered masculine. So that, these again are not biologically fixed. That whether one is born a woman or a man, how we act as women and men is culturally conditioned. So now jumping a little ahead in time. For many years, anthropology wavered between being a scientific discipline to the humanities, to a humanities discipline, to also a political science discipline. And it really wasn't until the 1970s that anthropology firmly situated itself within the sciences. And out of the 1970s comes this new wave of interpretive anthropology, which really focused on interpreting what was meaningful to that particular studied population. And you really owe this to a really prominent anthropologist who came out of the 1970s, which was Clifford Geertz. Geertz argued that cultures are a meaningful text that communities constantly read and that anthropologists therefore must decipher. So it's the anthropologist's role to sort of decipher culture, kind of like that culture is like a book that we read. And he came up with a methodology called thick description, which is a very detailed description of a particular human behavior or action that just not just explains the behavior or action, but also really goes further out to look at the context as well. Another big thing that came out of the 70s was a review or looking back at earlier anthropologists. And it was a way to sort of critique maybe some of the methodological as well as sort of ethical actions of anthropologists in the past. And you see this particularly with Derek Freeman, who came out of the 1970s, and his work looking at Margaret Mead's research. And here's Derek Freeman in the corner. So, going back to Mead's work in the Samoans, Derek Freeman actually goes back to that community, and he wants to sort of look at what Margaret Mead's sort of argument about the Samoans being more sexually free. So he goes back to that same community. Yes, it's 30 years later, but he's going back. And he sees that the way that it describes that community, the way that she did her research methods, were actually very much far from the truth. So he debunks Mead's description of the Samoans as being more sexually free. And in fact, he says that they're actually quite restrictive on sexuality. And he then sort of investigates, well, why did Mead come to these conclusions? Why did she write that Samoans were all these like sort of sexually free people when in fact there were harsh sort of rules of sexuality and having sex? And he sort of then he becomes very critical of Mead's research practice. Because what he finds out is that with the Samoan community, but also in the tribes in Papua New Guinea, Mead was never fluent in the language. In fact, she could not even speak the language at all. And she did not live within the communities, meaning that she did not live at the center of these villages. She did not interact with these communities on a day-to-day basis. Instead, she gathered her information mostly from secondary sources, so Christian missionaries and young girls traveling back and forth in the village. And what Derek Freeman finds out is that these young girls were kind of pulling Margaret Mead's leg. Like they were kind of gossiping and telling her something that wasn't necessarily true. But Mead took it as truth because she's not involved in the community. She's just listening to these outsiders. And that becomes sort of a problem, right? Of if it's your responsibility to write about a particular community and you then write falsities because because of the ways that you collect the information, again, what Derek Freeman really does is sort of show the faults in early anthropology. And it created a hotbed because Margaret Mead is and continues to be very much admired and beloved in anthropology, and it sparked an intense debate and controversy in the discipline of anthropology, as well as the general public. But one good thing that the Derek Freeman did was sort of really bring up to light and put it up front and center about the need for critical reflection on the researcher's role in the research. And we'll get to this more in the next class. So we're going to jump ahead just a little bit more. And we're going to get to this, what I like to call, these natives can speak for themselves. By the 1980s, many anthropologists began to question their inherent authority or right to speak on behalf of others. Challenged by feminists as well as Black, Latino, Asian, and Indigenous scholars, anthropologists began to look at their privilege in conducting research and the inequalities and misrepresentations they may be producing as Western-based researchers, doing research on mostly non-Western communities. Today, many anthropologists come from a variety of backgrounds and locations. Many non-Western, indigenous, and minority communities have actively done their own ethnographies of their communities and have challenged outsiders in writing about their culture. But with more diversity in the field of anthropologies, questions on privilege and bias still remain. And we're going to continue this conversation in the next class, but it's good to sort of set the stage right now. And this is the end of the lecture, so here are the key terms. The first one is emic, being investigating how the local populations or participants think. Etic emphasizes what the observer notices and considers important. Holism, looking at a culture as a whole and not separating it into little parts, looking at culture as being interconnected. And interpretive anthropology, describing and interpreting that which is meaningful to natives. And then thick description, a very detailed description of particular human behavior that explains not just the behavior, but its context as well. Thanks so much. See you in the next class.